Chair, we're now live.
Thank you. I will ask each person present to confirm that they can hear and be heard. Where practicable, please also have your video switched on. We have the following members of the forum. Beverly Blower.
Good afternoon, everyone. I appear to have an issue with my video at the moment, but I can confirm I can see and hear everybody else.
Thank you. Alex Davis. Paul Deneen.
Yes, I'm here and I can be heard, hopefully.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Right.
Richard Foster. Nikki Gilbert.
Yeah, I'm here and I can hear everybody.
Hi. Edward Gwilym.
Yes, I am here. I can hear everyone. Sorry, I have a bit of a problem with my camera.
That's okay. Good afternoon. Sue Jenkins. Paul Jennings.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I can see and hear you.
Chris Lewandowski.
Good afternoon, all. Yes, I can both see and hear you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Rose Lloyd.
Hi, I'm here and I can see and hear everybody.
Thank you. Hayley Manns. Gemma Martin.
Yeah, I'm present and I can see and hear everybody.
Thank you. Kathy Weston. Okay, the following officers may also be in attendance. So I know we've got Jen Priest, Claire Bellis-Powley.
I'm here, yes.
Isabel Biggs.
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Liz Farr.
Good afternoon, everybody. I can hear and see you, Alison. Thank you.
Thank you. Hilary Jones.
Hello, Alison. Yes, I can see and hear everybody. Thank you.
Hello. Kirsty Lister.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Hello. Louise Tanner.
Afternoon, everybody. Yes, I can see and hear you.
Good afternoon. Rachel Sanders.
Good afternoon, everyone. I can see and hear you.
Good afternoon. Councillor Ivan Powell.
Yes, hi, everybody. See and hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just to also add, Richard Foster has joined us as well. So, Richard, could you hear and see us?
Hello, yes, I can hear and see you.
Thank you. The agenda, papers and other relevant information for this meeting are available for public viewing on the Herefordshire Council website. The Council is streaming this meeting live on the Herefordshire Council YouTube channel, and a recording will be made available via the Council's website shortly after the meeting has concluded. Others are permitted to film, photograph and record our public meetings, providing that it does not disrupt the business of the meeting. Please use the raise your hand icon to indicate that you wish to speak. Please remember to lower your hand again after you have spoken. Where forum members are required to vote on an item, we will conduct an electronic vote. If there are problems with the vote, I will ask each member in turn to indicate verbally if they are for, against or abstaining. If a forum member has not been present for the whole of the discussion on an item due to technical failure, they should not vote on that item. Are there any questions about the procedures before we continue? Okay, so moving on to item 1 on the agenda, which is apologies for absence. Are there any apologies?
Chair, we've received apologies from Dan Breary, Andy Goslin, Nikki Emmett, Sheila Taylor, Tim Knapp and Georgie Griffin.
Thank you. On to item 2, named substitutes. Are there any named substitutes for this meeting?
Yes, Chair, we have Lynn Johnson, who's also in attendance. Lynn, can you hear us? Who is a substitute for Andy Goslin.
Hello, yes, I can hear and see you fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, item 3, declarations of interest. So this purpose of this item to receive any declarations of interest by members in respect of items on our agenda. So are there any declarations of interest this afternoon?
Yes, Alison, I can't seem to find the, put the hand up thing on my computer. So can I?
Yeah, I can see your hand is.
I quite have now, I think. But
Yeah.
it's just to say, because I'm the trade union representative, I think there may be something on the agenda relevant to that. So I'm declaring interest.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Chair. That'll be recorded.
Okay, thank you. Item 4 is minutes. The purpose of the item being to approve and sign the minutes of the last meeting, which was held on the 18th of October 2024. Are there any matters arising not dealt with elsewhere on the agenda? Chris Lewandowski.
Thank you, Chair. In the minutes on page 8, just before section 9, there was an action regarding a written response. I don't recall receiving that written response. Did it happen? If so, where is it? Thank you.
Yes, Chair. So all actions were responded to. I will, if you would mind giving me some time, I can find the date and that email. But if we could continue with the meeting.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Okay, so can we please bring up the voting screen? If you were not present at the last meeting, you should select the abstention option at the vote.
Chair, that's a majority and those minutes have been approved, and we will go back over that comment as made by Chris Lewandowski.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Moving on to item 5, the schools budget 2025-26. So in this item, we're looking to approve school forum's recommended budget proposals for school budgets, central school services and early years within the dedicated schools grant for 2025-26. So I call on Claire Bellis-Powley to present the report.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the presentation. So the presentation, as we've already said, is going to be about the DSG funding for 25-26. So the way I'm going to go about the presentation is I'm going to give a brief overview, which will cover sort of a very brief outline of all the blocks, and then I'm going to deep dive into each of the blocks individually. Next slide, please. So yes, as I said, we'll start with a little bit of background and a brief overview. So on the 18th of December, we received the final allocations from the DFE, and we also received our authority planning tool for the schools block, the high needs block and the central block. So for the schools block, we're receiving 138.2 million, which is a 2.36% funding per pupil year-on-year growth over 24-25. I think it's worth noting at this stage that when we received the authority planning tool and when we received the allocation, that the pupil number year on year has dropped by 339 pupils. So that is going to affect our funding block this year because it is a funding per pupil model. So it's 286 pupils lower for primary and then 53 pupils lower for secondary. The central block, we're going to be receiving 933.9 thousand, which is 0.8% higher than 24-25. For the high needs block, we're going to receive 28.9 million, which is 7.6 higher than 24-25. And then for the early years block, it's quite a considerable year-on-year growth for the early years block. So we're going to receive 24.1 million, which is 46.5% higher. And when we deep dive into that block, I'll explain why it's quite a bit higher than the other blocks. Next slide, please. So here is pretty much what I just said, but in more of a numbers form. So in the first block, you've got the 24-25 numbers, which is what we would have presented this time last year. So that was the allocation for 24-25. But then what we need to do in the second column is adjust that block, because in 25-26, we've had some grants rolled into the numbers. So if we want to compare the years on a like-for-like basis, then we have to roll the equivalent grants into 24-25, which is what that second column is doing. And then we can now compare it with the third column. So that, you know, again, this slide is just reiterating what I've said in the first slide, and it's more of a numbers view. Next slide, please. So I'm going to dive into the first block now, so the schools block. So I've already touched on the first point. So in 25-26, we do have some grants rolled in to the schools block. So we've got a roll in of the teachers' pay additional grant. We've got the teachers' pension employer contribution grant rolled in, and also the core schools budget grant. And then on top of that, they've also rolled in a full year's worth of the teachers' pay award, which they've called the CSBG uplift. So if I refer to the CSBG uplift, it means a full year effect of the teachers' pay award, because we only have a part year effect in 24-25. In the second point there, again, I've already touched on this point, but it's worth highlighting again, is that we have had a year-on-year decrease in pupil numbers. So the pupils have gone down by 339. We've also had a reduction in growth funding as well. So the growth funding in 24-25 is 0.6 million, and this year it's 0.3 million. Now, that is a number that the DfE calculate for us on our behalf. And what it does is it buffers us against movements in pupil numbers. On the fourth point, we're also going to carry out a 0.5% transfer from schools block to high needs block. So that's the maximum transfer that we can do with schools forum approval. Anything higher than that needs to go for a disapplication to the ESFA. So we're going to stick with the 0.5% this year. Once it gets to the high needs block, we then fund the SEND protection scheme, which I'll go into in a bit more detail in the future slides. And then the last point on this slide is that the DfE have given us a range which we can use for our minimum funding guarantee this year. So it's between minus 0.5% to 0%. So we are actually going to give the maximum we can at 0%. And what that means is that the year-on-year funding per pupil growth will not go down. So year-on-year, it will go up by 0% or higher. So no one's going to see a drop year-on-year in their funding per pupil growth. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit more on the schools block. So the funding per pupil growth has gone up by 2.36%. We saw that on a prior slide, but the department have been a little bit sneaky, because 1.28% of that is actually the CSBG uplift, so the full year effect of the teachers' pay award. So that's kind of built into our growth. So if we take the 2.36% and take off the 1.28%, the real or the true growth, as we could call it, is 1.08%. So, you know, and the red point below it says, you know, so we've got a reduction in growth funding, we've got a reduction in pupil numbers, and we have a limited amount of growth. So this year we have had to make some compromises in the APT tool in order to make it balance for our schools and to accommodate the block transfer that we need to do from schools block to high need block. The bottom table just sort of highlights the movement year on year. So in the top half of the table, you've got, you can see that the 2.36% year on year growth equates to a 1.1 million increase in funding. And then the bottom half of that table shows you how the 1.1 million of funding is made up. So you've got the drop in pupil number. So that's sort of going downwards by 2.1 million. And then upwards, you've then got the 1.28% for the CSBG uplift. And then essentially the balancing figure is the 1.08%, which is another uplift of 1.5 million. And so those three movements together make the overall year-on-year increase of 1.1 million. Next slide, please. So I've already mentioned the SEND protection scheme a few times now. So it's been hugely supported by Schools Forum in previous years, and it's something we'd like to continue this year. Just to explain how we calculate the SEND protection funding, we do a calculation for each school, which is it's the number of registered pupils times something we called a cap. So this year that cap is £175 per pupil, and we get an answer to that calculation. We then look at the number of SEND pupils and we times it by 6,000. So if the answer to the second calculation is higher than the first, we fund that difference to the schools so that a school is no worse off for taking SEND pupils, accommodating them and essentially taking over the average number of SEND pupils. It basically means that this borough can be extremely inclusive. And you can see in the third bullet point there, it's very much used and we very much distribute the funding to help with this. So we have 9 secondary schools benefiting from this scheme and 55 primary schools receiving the funding. The maximum primary payout is 51,000 and that's benefiting 14 SEND pupils. And the maximum SEND protection for secondary schools is 95,000 and that's benefiting 31 pupils. So you can see that if we took the SEND protection scheme away, a lot of schools wouldn't be able to make their budgets balance. There's an awful lot of schools involved and you can see sort of the magnitude of some of the payouts there. Next slide, please. So we considered everything. We've got the drop in pupils, the drop in growth funding. We've had to, we're going to have to make some compromises in our APT tool. So as we've already discussed with the SEND protection scheme, the SEND protection scheme actually sits in the high needs block. And the first bullet point there is to just talk a little bit about the high needs block in that it's currently, we currently have an in-year pressure of 7.6 million and we have a brought forward deficit of 6.1 million at the beginning of this financial year. So adding the brought forward and the current year deficit, we reach a cumulative forecast deficit position at the moment of 13.7 million as at 31st of March 2005. So you can see that, given the pressures on the high needs block, we really do need to do this block transfer from schools block to high needs block. And as we've already discussed, the maximum block transfer that we can do with schools forum approval is the 0.5%, which equates to around £690,000. So having explained all that, we then modelled 3 options within our authority planning tool. So option A is where we kept the gains cap at 2.45% and we kept the basic entitlement, which is the amount per primary or secondary pupil, at 100%. So this is where we're modelling probably as close to what we did in 24-25 as we can, almost to do a like comparison. Just to explain what the gains cap is. So the gains cap is almost the opposite of what the minimum funding guarantee cap. So the minimum funding guarantee guarantees, we've already said, will guarantee you a 0% funding per pupil growth year on year. And the gains cap will mean that nobody goes above 2.5 growth year on year. So just as a little explanation of what that is. So you can see with option A, we tweaked the 2 factors, but unfortunately we couldn't get the tool to work. So you can see sort of the red alarm colour there saying, the APT tool doesn't work. We didn't have enough funding by around 850,000, which means we wouldn't be able to get it to balance for schools and we wouldn't be able to do the block transfer. And essentially we would have to close the SEND protection scheme. So we moved on to option B, where we tweaked the factors a little bit more. So we lowered the gains cap to 2.1%, and then we tweaked the basic entitlement NFF factor for primary and secondary pupils from 100% down to 98.5%. So you can see by the happier amber colour that the tool got a little bit better. We still have a funding deficit of around 90 to 100k though. And what that means is we'd have to reduce the block transfer. So rather than using the maximum of 690, we'd have to take it down to 600. So we're not maximising the help there that we could give to the high needs block. So then we modelled option C. So again, we lowered the gains cap to 2% and we kept the basic entitlement factor at 98.5%. So that's in line with option B. And yes, you can see we have a happier green colour, which means that we got the tool to balance, the allocations worked for all the schools, and we were able to accommodate the full block transfer at 690k. So this is the council's preferred option, it's inclusive, and we can carry on with the very favoured SEND protection scheme. Next slide, please. So this is option C, so our green option displayed in a summary form. So this is what I can see in the authority planning tool. And believe me, it is a very summarised view of what I can see in that tool. So in the top, on the top lines, you can see the pupil numbers. So the top row are the numbers as per the October census. So you can see the drop in pupil numbers there. We then have a growth in Ayleston Primary, so we've included those 30 pupils, and overall we still have a drop in pupil numbers. The basic pupil entitlement, which is the next line down, you can see the drop in funding, but that will be driven by two things. Firstly, we have the drop in pupil numbers, and then that's where I've also reduced the basic entitlement for primary and secondary pupils down to 98.5%. The rest of the factors on this sheet I've pretty much kept as they are, as per how the department give them to us at 100%. I think it's worth noting on the caps and floors line, I have increased the funding there so that we can accommodate the minimum funding guarantee at 0%. So nobody's seeing a drop in funding per pupil year on year, and so that we can also apply the 2% gap, which is what option C proposes. And what that does is, so everyone's getting between 0 and 2.42%, and it means that we won't have any outliers. So nobody's going to get 10% at the expense of perhaps somebody who would then get minus 10%. So it's a fair system. It's a system we've used in previous years, and I think definitely worth funding. So next slide, please. So now we're at the point in the tool where we've balanced the tool, we've got enough money for our funding block transfer, and we have allocations by schools in the tool, and we're at the point now where we can fund some de-delegations and an education function cost. So this is something that can be voted on by the schools forum, and it has been voted on in previous years, but following this presentation, Democratic will bring up the votes, and Schools Forum can vote for it this year if they want to do it or not. So the first point notes that in October, we didn't have any numbers at that point. There was a delay in announcements, but we did, the Budget Working Group and Schools Forum both voted to roll forward the de-delegations in their physicality from 24-25 to 25-26. In the second bullet point, I now do have some numbers in place, so I'm going to raise the de-delegations and the education function costs by 2.36%, which you'll remember is the year-on-year funding per pupil increase. And that's the same methodology that we used last year. Last year it was 1.9%, just as a comparison. Next slide, please. So that's the schools block explained. So I'm now going to move on to the central block funding. So in this block, we also have some grants rolled in. So we've got the Teachers' Pension Employment Contribution Grant and also the Cool Schools Budget Grant rolled in. And it's to take care of the grants associated with the centrally employed teachers. We also have the copyright licenses rolled in. So they were all separate in 24-25, but now they're going to be included in this block for 25-26. And then the second half of the slide, you can see how the funding has increased. So as we did with the schools block, we need to rebase 24-25 for the additional grants as if they had have happened. Then we have 24-25 on a like-for-like basis. And so we can go from 926,195 up to the current funding amount, which is 933,855, which is a 0.8% increase. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we're just explaining how we're going to use that funding. So you can see at the bottom there, the 926,185 and the 933,855, so the year-on-year increase. And then above that, we explain how we're going to spend it. So there's very few changes that we've made from 24-25. It worked, we monitor it monthly, so we know if we have any favourability. One line we did see favourability on was the school admin costs. So you can see that's the third line down. We have reduced the cost of 25-26 because we are seeing some favourability in costs there. And, the upside of that is that any cost that we reduce here, we can then push down to the bottom line, which is our transfer to high needs block. So, where a line is decreasing, it's increasing on the bottom line, which means we can help our high needs block, which is in deficit at the moment. Next slide, please. So now we move on to our third block, which is the high needs block funding. So the first point we've already discussed. So I'm just reiterating the point that we have an in-year pressure of 7.6 million, which is being driven by independent school costs because we have an insufficient number of special school places in the borough. So overall, as at 31st of March 25, we will have a deficit of 13.7 million, which is the forecast at the moment. The high needs block for 25-26 is going to be 28.9 million. So that's increasing year on year by 7.6%. That's all I'm going to say on the high needs block at the moment. We are going to be doing some modelling in the current months, and we will bring you a detailed split of how we're going to spend our 28.9 million in the March Schools Forum. But I think everyone can probably tell that the funding is not sufficient, and it's very likely that I'm going to be bringing you a small deficit to sign off at the beginning of the year, like we did last time. Next slide, please. So this is the last block that I'm going to present. So in the first bullet point there, so the early education funding was issued by the department on the 10th of December. So we received that allocation separately from the schools block and the central and the high needs block, which was a week later. The main change for early years this year was that there was an increase in pass-through. So this year for 24-25, the pass-through is 95%, whereas for 25-26, it's increased to 96%. So what that means is that providers for every pence are getting more pence in the pound passed to them, and it limits what the council can retain. That's actually going to improve even further next year with an anticipated pass-through rate of 97%. You'll remember that from the first slide, the early years block year on year had an increase of 46%. And the third bullet point sort of is a summary of almost exactly why that has happened. And it's because the provisions for 2-year-old working parent entitlement and under 2-year-old have increased from 15 hours up to 30 hours. And hence the funding has increased substantially to accommodate that. The last bullet point, there's also an expectation that local authorities will announce their funding rates by the 28th of February this year. That will become a requirement for 26-27. So it's an expectation this year, and we absolutely will be able to hit that deadline, and it's a requirement for next year and the years following that. Next slide, please. So here is a breakdown of the early years funding block. So at the bottom there, you can see the 16.42 rising to the 24.07 for 25-26. So that is the 46% increase. And you can see above it what's happened. So for under twos, I've got my biggest year-on-year increase there. So there's three things going on that line. So you've got a rate increase, an hourly, so there's an amount per rate which has gone up year on year. Secondly, the 15-hour entitlement for under twos only began in September 24. So we're not seeing a full year effect of that in the 24-25 funding numbers. That will happen in the 25-26 numbers. And then the third thing that's happening there is the provision is increasing from 15 hours up to 30 hours per week. So that's what's driving such a large year-on-year increase there. The second line is the 2-year-old funding, and then it's families receiving additional support. That's what FRAS stands for. That's where they've renamed the 2-year-old disadvantage category. So year on year, you can see a 3.5% increase there. So it's just a rate increase there because the hours are staying the same at 15 hours. There's no provision increase in hours there. 2-year-old funding working parents. So again, you've got three things going on there. The rate increase. You've got the fact that the 15-hour entitlement only began in April 24 for 24-25. So we're not really seeing a full year effect of that this year, but we will next year, and that's been factored in the budget. And then again, you've got the provision increase from 15 hours up to 30 hours. So again, it's quite a hefty 61% increase year on year there. The 3- and 4-year-old funding line, so universal and extended, is already split into its 15-hour and its 30-hour provisions. So you're just seeing a rate increase there. It's worth noting that the rate increase is bigger for 3- and 4-year-old funding versus the other category, which just saw a rate increase, which was the 2-year-old funding FRAS. And for 3- and 4-year-olds, they've rolled in an additional grant, hence why it's a little bit higher. EYPP is seeing a 47% year-on-year increase, so that's where the rate is going from this year at 68 pence per hour up to £1 per hour. And then the disability funding is also increasing from £910 per pupil up to £938 per pupil. So you can see that's that sort of a highlight of why we're seeing such a hefty increase in this block, and overall it is 46%. Next slide, please. So this is the rate summary that we presented to early years providers. So we met with the steering group before Christmas for early years, and then we had a consultation with all the providers. Everyone was invited for us to go through all this with them. And then after that, we also did a Survey Monkey as well, where they could vote on some of the options that we gave them. And this was the final view that everyone has decided on. So the top table was a revision of what we did in 24-25. So the first column are the rates that were given to us by the DfE. The council then take out 2.7%. So this year we were allowed to take 5%, but we took out 2.7%, so a lot lower. And then in the rest of the columns, so SEN inclusion, deprivation and rurality, that's where we're taking money out of the rates, but giving it back to providers in a different way. So SEN inclusion fund is given back via SEN pupil, and deprivation is given back via EYPP number. And then for rurality, what we discovered was that many years ago, it was set up to accommodate small rural providers. But what's actually happening in reality now is that it's being taken out of the 3- and 4-year-old rate and given back to them, or all of them, just in a separate payment. So for 25-26, we've considered it in a slightly different way. So that's the middle table. So again, the first column is us getting our rates from providers. We've then kept the retention at 2.7%, so we haven't increased it, and it's very much within the 4% that we're allowed to take. And then again, we are taking amounts out for SEN inclusion and deprivation and giving them back to providers in a different way. So for SEN inclusion, this time we're taking it out of all the rates rather than just 3- and 4-year-old rate, which is what we did in 24-25, because it's given back across all rates depending on SEN pupil number. So if everyone's benefiting from it, we should take it out of all the rates in the first place. And the same concept for deprivation. So rather than 3- and 4-year-olds just funding it, everyone can fund it in the first place, and then it's given back to all rate provisions based on EYPP number. And given what we witnessed with rurality, where it was just taken out and given back to all 3- and 4-year-old providers, we are just going to keep it in the rate this year. It's just a simpler process. So it's within their £5.47, which is the last column. So on the middle table in the last column are the rates that the early years providers will receive in April. Next slide, please. So how are we going to spend our 2.7% pot? So I've already said it's well below the 4% that we are allowed to take. And the way we're going to spend it is by funding roles. The roles that it will fund is the early years improvement advisors, the early years inclusion officers, the early years lead improvement officer, and the early education funding team. And what duties do they carry out? So they train early years providers, they provide advice, support, visits, sit on funding panels and attend Ofsted feedback, and the early education funding team make payments, adjustments, headcount, census for early years. Next slide, please. So that draws a close to my presentation. So I've given the high level overview and I've deep dived into the blocks. So I'm going to hand over to Democratic now so that the Schools Forum can vote on what's been recommended by Budget Working Group and laid out in Appendix 3 for you to vote on.
Thank you, Claire, for your really detailed presentation. And before we move to the vote, are there any comments or questions for Claire from forum members? Chris Lewandowski.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question regarding early years provision. Does provision of early years places match demand both numerically and geographically within the county? And what will happen in September 25 when the next stream comes online? Thank you.
I wonder if one of the service team could comment on that.
Hi, Claire. Yes, do you want me to, it's Louise Tanner, do you want me to respond? Hi, yes. So as part of the mapping for the extension of the childcare provision, we've obviously done some done that mapping. Currently, we don't have an issue with places in the county. There isn't a current pressure. We have places across the county and we have enough places. We're obviously doing projections going forward. There are some small pressures in terms of areas rather than numbers. So we are aware of it and are working with our colleagues around that.
Thank you. Does that mean there'll be an underspend?
That's something that we will monitor when we do our in-year monitoring, which we do monthly. That is something that we will look at every single month. And if we are underspending, and if there's anything we can do to push that money away to towards the high needs block or help with that in any way, we will bring it to Schools Forum and keep you updated.
Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Deneen.
Just to say, really, well done, Claire. I think the important thing from my point of view is that this has gone through a fairly rigorous process. We've got the Schools Budget Working Party has looked into this. I've noted, and I think applaud the fact that you've engaged with a number of the sort of early age communities just to get their feedback and also to get the Survey Monkey, etc. So I think that in terms of making decisions on this, the information evidence you've provided, I think, is a thorough process. I think it's all been handled exceptionally professionally, and everybody's been involved in the engagement process. And just to say well done, really, to you and the team for getting this all sorted. I think we're probably in a much, much better place in Herefordshire than we are in lots of other counties. And I know there's a deficit mentioned, but when you look at some of the figures in some of the other counties, they are simply horrendous. I don't think the government have yet realised that there is a major, well, perhaps they are beginning to realise, but they're not funding it. It's a big issue with regard to send throughout the country, and there needs to be a significant investment in that area. And perhaps, you know, from our perspective, we have got the sort of you know, we're not out of the woods with regard to our overall budget, but I think we've got the best deal on the table, which is going to help the young people of Herefordshire. And just say thank you for all your hard work regarding that.
No problem. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Paul Jennings, as chair of the Budget Working Group, do you want to comment on the discussions that were held at that group on the 10th of January and the recommendations of the group?
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to start off by echoing Paul's words, really, and thank Claire for the hard work that she put into the preparation of this, and particularly in light of the fact that some of the information was really quite late in terms of coming through. So thank you, and for the clarity, it certainly helped Budget Working Group in their conversation and deliberations. There's no doubt the Budget Working Group feel very strongly that they would like to continue to support the high needs budget through the transfers that we've made for a number of years now, certainly ever since I've been involved with Budget Working Group, which is rather longer than I care to think. The conversation, however, was how much longer are we going to be able to do that and to support the high needs budget, because if we can't support the high needs budget from transfer from schools block in particular, then it leaves the picture looking, well, slightly less healthy than it is at the moment. And, you know, I would echo concerns that something really needs to be done in terms of SEN funding nationally, and we'll do whatever we can to support that high needs block whatever we can, and we'll continue to do so. It was a good conversation. It was very clear what the outcome was going to be, that the recommendation of Budget Working Group was to support that recommendation and to continue supporting the SEN support scheme. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Liz Farr, Service Director for Education, Skills and Learning. Is there any comment that you would like to make?
I echo, Chair, the comments that have been made. Finance, alongside the service, have worked really hard on putting together the papers that you've seen this afternoon and working very closely, representing both the early years children in terms of the discussions we've had, as well as SEND in the county, and the proposals have my full support. Thank you.
Thank you. Same question for Rachel Sanders as Director of Finance, if there's any comments you'd like to make.
No, just to echo the service and the comments from the chair of the working group, there's been an incredible amount of work across the team. I think we've brought a refresh of clarity this year through Claire's focus, and I'm really proud of the way that we've all worked together to get to this point.
Thank you, Rachel. So if there's no further comments or questions, then we'll move on to voting on the recommendations, which are all set out in Appendix 3 at the end of the report. Voting on each recommendation may be restricted by regulation. For clarity, I will set out who can vote on each block of recommendations as we vote. Those attendees who are not eligible to vote on a particular block of recommendations, please abstain in the upcoming polls. The recommendations are to be grouped into 6 blocks for ease of voting unless there are any objections from forum members. No. Okay, great. Thank you. So we're moving to vote number 1. This is for all forum members, and it's on recommendation 3 as set out in the report, that being the transfer of £690,827 to the high needs block to support the SEN protection scheme. Please cast your vote and press the submit button. If you can't see the voting screen or you can't vote, please raise your hand.
Thank you, Chair. There's a couple who haven't managed to vote there, but we have a majority and that those recommendations can be approved. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We'll now move on to vote 2. This is for only schools, academies and early years members. It's specific to recommendations 1A to F as set out in the report, covering school funding values. All values to be recommended to the Cabinet member are set at 100% except primary basic entitlement, Key Stage 3 basic entitlement and Key Stage 4 basic entitlement, which is recommended at 98.5%. Those who cannot vote include trade unions, 16 to 19 representatives and diocese representatives. Please cast your vote and press the submit button. If you can't see the voting screen or are unable to vote, please raise your hand.
Again, Chair, a couple not voted, but we have a clear majority and those recommendations can be approved.
Thank you. We'll now move on to vote 3. This is for all forum members. It's specific to recommendations 2 and 4 as set out in the report, covering growth funding, approval for minor adjustments and central support services. So please cast your vote and press the submit button as before. If you can't see the screen or are unable to vote, please raise your hand.
Same situation as before, Chair, but we have a clear majority and again, that can be approved.
Thank you. I'll move on now to vote 4. This is for local authority primary and secondary school members only. Recommendation 5, items A to I, as set out in the report, to approve an increase of 2.36% in the dedelegation of funding and education management function for 2025-26. Voting on this item is restricted by regulation to representatives of local authority schools only, and further restricted by phase where dedelegation applies specifically to primary or secondary schools. In addition, local authority special schools may vote on item 1 only. As this is a small number, I will ask the clerk to take the vote by roll call.
Item I, that was Alison.
I, yes, sorry, I realised what I tried to say.
No problem. Actually, Alison, it's only you can vote on this item as all others have left the meeting or are not attending. So do you approve the recommendations?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to vote 5, local authority schools, academies and early years members only. Recommendation 6, A to D, that the early years funding formula for Herefordshire providers from April 2025 be approved. Please cast your vote and press the submit button. If you can't see the voting screen or you're unable to vote, please raise your hand.
Thank you, Chair. Again, we have a clear majority, a couple not voted, but we can approve those recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll move on now to the final vote. Vote 6 for all 4 members. Recommendation 6, so from E to G. The recommendation is that the early years retained central expenditure be approved. Please cast your vote and press the submit button. If you can't see the voting screen or you're unable to vote, please raise your hand.
Nothing's come up on the screen. Is it coming? Has it come up yet, Jenny? Or
Yeah, apologies, Chair. I'm having trouble launching that poll.
should we go by hand then?
As it's for all members, do all members just want to raise their hand to say they're in approval?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I can approve those recommendations on show of hands.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That concludes the end of the voting and the school's budget 2025-26. So on to the final item, which is just thank you all for attending, and I will now call the meeting to a close. Our next meeting is Friday, the 14th of March. Please going to have confirmation that the live stream has stopped.
Thank you, Chair. I will close the live stream, but just to echo Chris Lewandowski's actions from the minutes previously, I will recirculate those, but they have been circulated, okay? And I will just end the live stream.
Thank you.
The live stream ended.
Thank you, Alison.
Okay, thank you.